think early on you talked about missed opportunities. I was reading recently in Barbara Tuchman's book, Practicing History, and she goes on to talk about in 1945 the communists, they wanted to come and talk to Roosevelt, but the American ambassador didn't pass on the message, you know, and of course 5 years later Chiang Kai-shek fell down. But the point she makes is very interesting. She surmises that if the communists did come to Washington and talk to Roosevelt, there's a good possibility that there would not have been a Korean War or a Vietnam War. So I wondered what opportunities you were thinking about.
About that episode, I don't know because I'm just not informed. I wouldn't say anything about it also because my father-in-law, Ambassador William vanden Heuvel, who is long head of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Institute, is probably the leading authority in the world on this subject, and I'm definitely going to get it wrong and pay the price. So, but let me say one thing about this question about Stalin, because it's very important. There is a big debate among people who study diplomatic international history of whether the Cold War that followed World War II, when we were allies and co-victors, was inevitable. One point of view says that given the nature of the Soviet communist system under Stalin, nothing we could have done one way or the other was going to change avoid a very Cold War. The Russians were going to take over, the Soviets were going to take over Eastern Europe, and all the rest. The other view is no, we acted in a very this is called used to be called the revisionist history of the Cold War. We acted in a very provocative way. We didn't seize opportunities of the kind you mentioned that came our way. And therefore, we essentially kept shoving and shoving and shoving until the Soviet leadership did what came natural to them. They became aggressive. You know, it's a very special subject. You have to know the diplomatic history of that period. My own view is, though, because I feel I know a lot about Stalin, and Stalin as a leader, is that Stalin was a Cold War personality. That was what the Great Terror was all about. He saw enemies everywhere and he killed them. And when he wasn't able to kill them, he built an Iron Curtain to keep them out. That's what the Iron Curtain was. It wasn't to keep the Russians in, it was to keep us out. Our culture, our politics, ourselves. Given that political psychology, and given the fact that he had absolute power, he did, I don't see that there was much of an alternative. That's the one moment where I'm kind of inclined to be a guy without an alternative. It could have been a less severe Cold War. Or did it have to last 40 years? No. Did there have to be a nuclear arms race? No. Did we have to drop the bomb on Japan to teach the Russians a lesson? I don't know. There's two sides of that story too. I just don't know enough. But Stalin, once Stalin left and joined the majority, as Russians say, everything became possible in the Soviet Union because power was no longer absolute. But while he was there, I just am not very sure there was much of an alternative.
There's someone.
I was hoping, Professor Cohen, that you could address book regarding KGB spying in the United States of America, in which during this period, even beginning, I believe, in the 30s, that supposedly I.F. Stone was a KGB agent. Robert Oppenheimer was absolved of such a charge, and others named, even including Papa Hemingway. This was, I wondered if you would clarify your views on this period when it would appear, you know, by the buzz you hear on the internet and elsewhere that, you know, the Soviet spies were just all over the place in Washington, D.C.
I don't see you, and it's awkward talking to someone. Can you just wave at me so I can see where you are? Hi. Actually, my wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel, knows more about this than I do because her magazine has been a forum for debating this issue, which is essentially the degree to which people in the United States who were sympathetic to the Soviet Union or even communist were actually agents literally spies operated by the KGB. There are people in this country who, for political and financial reasons, have made an industry out of publishing alleged discoveries in alleged archives, proving that they, including I.F. Stone, Hemingway, and others, were. Alas, some university presses, not Columbia University Press, have published these books to the discredit of those university presses. If you want to read somebody who really knows what they're talking about, either last week or the week before, in the Times Literary Supplement, which I believe is you can read on the internet, there was a review of two of these books that have just appeared, alleging that Hemingway and I.F. Stone were Soviet agents. But she, because she's a Russian reader and an archive expert, was able to look at the archives that they claim to have used. And what she concludes is that these American authors never actually saw any archive documents. They were told about them. They were told about them. Read that and see the way she dismantles these two very scholarly, outwardly books. One other point. We knew because they came out of the cold when the Soviet Union ended, a few KGB guys who were assigned to us in the bad old days. And they were quite affable guys, and one was writing his dissertation about me. And he wanted to know if he could interview me, and by the way, they didn't have certain books. But one of the things when I listened to them is it went like this. A KGB guy is posted in the United States, or he visits the United States in a trade delegation. His bosses want to know how many Americans he turned to during his 3 days in New York. So he writes back, you know, I had lunch with the famous journalist I.F. Stone. He was pumping me for information, but I think I got him on our side. So the minder in Moscow now writes down, I.F. Stone is ours. That piece of paper is dropped into an archive, because an archive is rubbish in and rubbish out. If a document is valid, then the archive's valid. If the document is falsified, then the archives. You have to be skilled to know how to use these materials. And the people who are writing this stuff have an agenda, and they aren't skilled, and they don't care what they're doing. So I would be very wary of these allegations.
There has been terrible misuse and abuse of archives, as Steve spoke about. I would simply recommend one book and one review. Don Gutenplan spent 20 years working on a superb biography of I.F. Stone, which came out about a month ago, called American Radical. And it is very much worth reading because he eviscerates the abuse of archives, which have argued that I.F. Stone was a Soviet agent. I'd also read a review he wrote for The Nation about a month ago about the failure of our scholarly profession to have even the rudiments of a dialogue, a debate. This was a conference, I believe, at the Wilson Center, where those who were there to make the case about a different interpretation based on archives were essentially excluded, which goes to what Steve was talking about earlier, which is the scripting or the rescripting of history to meet the politics of our times as opposed to understanding the context of a different time.